Dear friends, welcome to the channel The Eastern Front. Today we will talk about one useful device that Soviet tankers copied from Japanese tanks. Regarding Japanese tank building, there are a lot of misconceptions, sometimes looking slightly ridiculous. Japanese tanks are considered almost the worst because of hulls and turrets assembled on rivets and rails. For example, American tank construction finally switched to fully welded hulls and turrets only in the second half of 1942. It is also worth recalling that the British tank building finally switched to welding even later than the Japanese in 1944. By that time, the Japanese had been using welding for the second year. In addition, American and Japanese tanks looked equivalent in combat characteristics. Moreover, the first clash of Japanese and American tanks, which happened on December 22, 1941 in Luzon, ended in favor of Japanese tankers from the 4th Tank Regiment. The problem started by 1943 because the Japanese had the same problem as the Italians, namely the inability to catch up with opponents in the arms race. Of course, the Japanese tank building had enough problems and technically backward elements, but in general, Japanese tanks did not perform so badly. They were very reliable. Some, in the form of civilian cars, survived until the 80s. They had air-cooled diesel engines. The suspension turned out to be quite successful. With the same dimensions as the combat vehicles of other countries, the Japanese tanks inside turned out to be more rationally arranged. It cannot be said that the Japanese used advanced technologies. However, there were cases when their technical solutions were copied by other countries. In particular, one such decision was adopted by Soviet tank builders. For the first time, Soviet military specialists got acquainted with Japanese tanks back in 1938, when Type 89 medium tanks captured by Chinese troops were studied. Russians studied them right on the spot. They managed to get to know Japanese tanks more closely a year later. During the battles near the Khalkhin-Gol River, 2 tank regiments were allocated to strengthen the Kwantung Army, the 3rd and the 4th. The 3rd Tank Regiment consisted of 26 medium tanks, Type 89, 4 newest medium tanks, Type 97, Chaiha, one of them commander, 11 small tanks, Type 94, and 4 newest small tanks, Type 97, Taiki. The 4th Tank Regiment had 36 Type 95, Hago, light tanks, 8 tanks, Type 89 medium tanks, and 4 Type 94 small tanks. For the Japanese tank forces, the battles of July 3, 1939 became the peak of usage in battles. Clashes with Red Army units did not end well. In the battle on July 3, 41 to 44 tanks were lost, that is, more than half of those available at that time, 13 of them irretrievably. What is even more unpleasant, several tanks were captured. Among them was Lieutenant Ito's Hago tank. The tank was sent to the firing field in Kubinka near Moscow, where the vehicle was partially restored, while conducting a study. From a constructive point of view, the tank did not arouse much interest, with the exception of 3 points. One of them turned out to be a small Japanese know-how, a button for communication with the crew. One of the main tasks of Japanese tanks was to interact with infantry units. Communication on them, as a rule, was not, and the tank is quite noisy, so for the first time, Japanese designers introduced a fairly simple, but at the same time useful thing. A button disguised as a rivet appeared on the aft sheet of the hull. If you don't know about its existence, you will never guess what it is intended for. The idea was simple and at the same time extremely useful. The infantrymen coming from behind pressed this very button, after which a sound signal was triggered. Thus, the tank commander received a signal from behind that the infantry needed something. It would seem that the idea lies on the surface, but for some reason no one guessed this before the Japanese. Following Hago, Chaiha received a similar button. In this tank, the button was placed in the lower left corner of the stern. The last Japanese tank to have exactly the same button was Shinhodo Chaiha. In the future, the Japanese abandoned this idea. Why, it is unknown. Maybe they often did not use the button, because not everyone knew about it. Write your guesses in the comment. Japanese tank builders stopped using a secret rivet button to communicate with the crew in 1943. Just at this very time, Soviet tank builders suddenly remembered about this idea. It happened in the autumn of 1943. Who exactly remembered is unknown, but the place can be said for sure. It was in Chelyabinsk, after the heavy tank Object 237 was adopted by the Red Army as the Is-85. There was nothing like this in the list of improvements for the tank, but during the conversion of the second sample of Object 237 into Object 240 from the left side, between the additional fuel tanks, the same button appeared. The action of the Soviet version of the crew communication button was no different from what the Japanese did. When the button was pressed, a cheerful beep was heard, after which the commander was keenly interested in what was happening. Unlike the Japanese, Soviet designers did not hide the button. It appeared from the very first serial Is-85. It was also introduced on the ISU. The most interesting thing is that they did not introduce anything like this on the T-34, although the need for communication with the crew was already obvious for many countries. The Soviet design had one significant drawback. The fact is that the location of the button between the fuel tanks made its use dangerous. If you stretch out your hand to her, and the tank goes at this time, it could break or even tear off your hands. The understanding that it did not work out very well appeared at the beginning of 1944, when the tanks went to training units. In March 1944, the location of the button was changed to the S and ISU. It was moved to the right edge of the hull side sheet. Thus, it became convenient to use it, and most importantly safe. On Is-2 heavy tanks and ISU 152/ISU 122 self-propelled guns, the external call button, as it was officially called, was put until the very end of production. But on Is-3, for unknown reasons, it did not take root for a long time. Officially, it stopped being staged on July 20, 1945. There was no communication with the crew on the Is-4, but on the T-10 the button returned, and later work began on an improved communication system with the crew. Meanwhile, in the second half of the 40s, work began abroad on the same topic. The main instigators were the Americans, who did not look for difficult ways and simply began to place a field phone on the stern of the tank. This idea quickly spread in a number of countries. In conclusion, another country where the Japanese button has taken root suddenly was Czechoslovakia. Most likely, they spied this very button on the Is and ISU, which were part of the Czechoslovak army. So on the T-34-85 and Su-100, SD-100, Czechoslovak production has a separate port on the starboard side. It is a clear sign of a Czechoslovak-made tank, or has been modernized in Czechoslovakia. If only the Japanese knew how far their secret button would go. Dear friends, that's all for today. Please leave any comments and put likes. See you.